It began with a simple survey. A team of archaeologists in Eastern Europe was using ground-penetrating radar to map farmland before construction. They expected to find the usual traces of old settlements, pottery shards, maybe burial pits from the Bronze Age. But what their instruments revealed was so enormous, so impossible, that they first assumed it had to be a mistake. Beneath the soil stretched a structure unlike anything they had seen before, a vast network of circular ditches, posts, and walls forming a geometric pattern nearly as large as several football fields. When the data was processed and the images rendered, the outlines became undeniable. Buried for 6,000 years, hidden under the gentle curves of farmland, was a massive ancient complex, older than Stonehenge, older than the Great Pyramids of Giza. The discovery shocked the scientific world. The structure, dubbed a mega-henge, dated back to around 4000 BCE. Its sheer scale was staggering, circular enclosures more than 500 feet in diameter, with multiple rings of posts and ditches arranged in perfect symmetry. For a people with no metal tools, no wheels, and no written language, the construction was unthinkable. And yet, there it was. Proof carved into the earth that prehistoric humans had built something monumental long before we believed them capable of it. What unsettled scientists most was not just the size, but the precision. The rings were laid out with astonishing accuracy, aligned to celestial events. Certain entrances matched the rising and setting of the sun on solstices and equinoxes. Others appeared to align with lunar cycles, suggesting that the builders were not simply farmers or herders, but keen observers of the sky. They understood the movements of the heavens in ways that seemed far ahead of their time. When excavations began, the evidence grew stranger. At the bases of the ditches, archaeologists uncovered human bones. Some were complete burials, but many were fragmented. Skulls separated from bodies, bones burned and broken. Intermixed with the remains were animal bones, pottery, and tools. These were not casual graves. They were ritual deposits, deliberately placed as part of ceremonies that had once echoed across the site. The discovery forced a chilling conclusion. This massive structure was not just a gathering place. It was a temple of ritual and sacrifice, where life and death were bound to the cycles of the cosmos. The sheer manpower required to build it was staggering. Thousands of wooden posts, each weighing hundreds of pounds, had been erected in concentric rings. Deep ditches had been dug using nothing but antler picks and stone tools. Soil was carried away in baskets, hauled by hand, generation after generation. It would have taken years, even decades, to complete. For a society of prehistoric farmers, the effort would have been almost unimaginable. Why devote so much labor to a monument with no practical purpose? The answer could only be belief. Belief in something powerful enough to justify a structure on this scale. Perhaps it was a temple of the sun, where ceremonies marked the eternal return of light and darkness. Perhaps it was a burial ground for elites, their deaths synchronized with the stars. Or perhaps it was something darker, a place where human lives were offered to ensure the turning of the seasons, the fertility of crops, the survival of the tribe. But the most shocking revelation came from the bones themselves. Isotope analysis showed that many of the individuals buried there were not locals. Some had traveled hundreds of miles before their deaths. This meant the site was not merely a local ritual center. It was a place of pilgrimage, drawing people from across vast regions, just as Stonehenge would centuries later. The discovery shattered long-held assumptions about Neolithic society. These people were supposed to be simple farmers, scattered in small villages, living short and brutal lives. Yet here was evidence of complex organization, shared belief systems, and monumental architecture on a scale rivaling anything in the ancient world. The builders of this mega-henge were not primitive. They were planners, engineers, astronomers, and priests, capable of uniting thousands of people around a single vision. The structure's design only deepened the mystery. The multiple rings, with entrances aligned to the sun and moon, suggested that it functioned as a giant calendar, By observing the light passing through the posts and ditches, the builders could track the seasons, predict eclipses, and mark ritual days with precision. For an agricultural society, such knowledge would have been vital, but the ceremonies tied to this knowledge seemed to have demanded blood. Among the bones, archaeologists found clear evidence of violent death. Some skulls bore the marks of blunt trauma, others deep cuts from stone axes. In one pit, the remains of a young woman were found, her hands bound before death. In another, a child's bones were buried alongside the carcass of a dog, as though both had been offered together. These were not the quiet burials of a peaceful society. They were ritual killings, sacrifices made to gods or forces we can only guess at. And then came the final shock. Carbon dating revealed that this structure predated both Stonehenge and the pyramids by centuries. At a time when we thought humans were only just learning to farm, they were building vast ceremonial complexes that required planning, cooperation, and a shared vision of the cosmos. The story of human history had to be rewritten. The great monuments of Egypt and Mesopotamia were no longer the first signs of civilization. Across Europe, 6,000 years ago, people were already raising massive structures, binding their lives and deaths to the stars. The question that now haunts archaeologists is simple: how much more is still buried beneath the soil, waiting to be found? Part 2, the discovery of the 6,000-year-old massive ancient structure shook the archaeological world to its core. At first, many assumed it was just a local anomaly, a strange outlier that told us something unusual about one community in Europe. But as more evidence came in, it became clear that this was not an isolated story. The structure was part of something much larger, a pattern of monumental building that stretched across continents, connecting cultures we once thought were too simple, too scattered, to create anything on such a scale. To understand the impact, we have to step back and look at what we thought we knew about human history. For decades, the dominant view was simple. Civilization began in Mesopotamia around 500 BCE, when cities like Uruk rose, writing was invented, and kings built temples to their gods. Egypt followed soon after, with the pyramids and dynasties of the pharaohs. Europe, by this logic, lagged behind. Scattered farming villages, small communities with little central organization. But this new discovery broke that timeline apart. Here was evidence that 6 millennia ago, long before the pyramids, people in Europe were already creating monumental architecture with cosmic precision. And this is not the only case. Similar discoveries have surfaced in recent decades. At Göbekli Tepe in modern-day Turkey, archaeologists uncovered a site more than 11,000 years old. Stone circles carved with animals and symbols, built before agriculture had even fully taken root. In Malta, massive stone temples dating back to 600 BCE show alignments to the solstices, just like Stonehenge. In Peru, the site of Caral boasts pyramids nearly as old as Egypt's, constructed by a culture that left behind no written language. Each of these finds once seemed unique. Now, archaeologists are starting to realize they may be connected, not directly by trade or conquest, but by a shared pattern of human behavior, the urge to build monuments that tied life and death to the heavens. The newly discovered mega-structure fits perfectly into this pattern. Its multiple rings, aligned to solstices and lunar cycles, mirror what we see at Stonehenge, though it predates it by centuries. Its use of ritual pits filled with bones echoes the practices found at Göbekli Tepe, where offerings of animals and possibly humans were part of ceremonies. Its sheer scale and geometry rival the temples of Malta. Taken together, the evidence suggests that monumental building was not the invention of a single culture like Egypt or Mesopotamia. It was a tradition far older, spread across humanity, perhaps inherited from an even deeper past. This forces a difficult question: where did the knowledge come from? Some archaeologists argue that it developed independently, that humans everywhere discovered the importance of the sun, moon, and stars and naturally began building structures aligned to them. But others whisper about something else. What if there was an earlier civilization, long forgotten, that passed down fragments of knowledge? What if the builders of these monuments inherited techniques of astronomy and construction from ancestors who lived thousands of years before recorded history? The controversial idea of a lost civilization has haunted archaeology for decades. For most of the 20th century, it was dismissed as fantasy, the stuff of Atlantis myths. But discoveries like Göbekli Tepe and this new mega-structure make the question harder to ignore. How could Stone Age farmers, with no wheels, no metal, no writing, design complexes that required sophisticated geometry and long-term astronomical observation? How could they align monuments so precisely to events like solstices and lunar standstills, which occur only once every 18.6 years? The discovery also raises questions about human organization. To build such a massive structure required not just labor, but leadership. Farmers would have had to set aside their own survival needs, planting, harvesting, caring for animals, to contribute to the construction. That means there must have been leaders or priests powerful enough to command them, belief systems strong enough to unite them, and traditions binding enough to sustain the project across generations. In other words, civilization, just not in the form we expected. The bones uncovered in the pits add to the unsettling picture. They reveal a society where ritual and death were central, where people may have traveled hundreds of miles to participate in ceremonies that ended in sacrifice. This mirrors discoveries at Stonehenge, where remains also showed evidence of long-distance travel. These sites may have acted as sacred hubs, drawing communities from across wide regions. Imagine thousands of people converging from distant lands, bringing animals, goods, and offerings to gather in massive ceremonies under the stars. The global impact of this discovery has been profound. Some scientists have suggested we are looking at evidence of a shared prehistoric culture, what they call a Neolithic cosmology. Across continents, humans who had never met may have shared the same visions, to connect the earth with the heavens through monuments, to tie their lives and deaths to the cycles of the cosmos. But others go further. Alternative researchers, emboldened by these findings, suggest the possibility that knowledge of astronomy and geometry was passed down from a civilization destroyed in the last ice age, around 12,000 years ago. Rising seas and climate catastrophes would have erased much of their traces, leaving behind only myths, and perhaps instructions carried forward in ritual. Mainstream archaeologists remain skeptical, but the new mega-structure discovery has breathed new life into the debate. The public has been fascinated, even unsettled. For generations we believed history was simple cavemen, then farmers, then cities, then pyramids. But the evidence beneath the soil says otherwise. Civilization may not have begun 5,000 years ago. It may stretch back far deeper into time, in ways we are only beginning to uncover. And then comes the question that no one can answer: why did it all stop? If Neolithic people could build massive cosmic monuments, why did they not continue advancing? Why did they not leave behind writing, metallurgy, or cities? Some suggest climate change or famine cut their culture short. Others think their knowledge was sacred, never meant to be practical, and died with their priests. The darker theory is that they knew something we do not, that the world was too unstable, too dangerous to continue. Whatever the truth, the discovery of this 6,000-year-old structure has forced us to rewrite the story of humanity. Our ancestors were not simple. They were builders of cosmic machines, engineers of ritual landscapes, and keepers of knowledge we still struggle to understand. The ground has given up a piece of its secret, but many more lie buried, waiting. And with every discovery, the timeline of history stretches further back, leaving us to wonder just how much of our past has been lost in the silence of time. Part 3. The first two parts of the investigation shocked the world with their implications of scale, precision, and cosmology. But as archaeologists dug deeper into the 6,000-year-old site, the story grew darker. The bones uncovered within the pits and ditches hinted at ceremonies far more disturbing than feasts or gatherings. They suggested that this massive ancient structure was not only a monument to the heavens, it was a place where blood was spilled deliberately, where human life was bound to forces beyond our understanding. The bones told the tale with grim clarity. Many were fractured in ways that did not match natural death. Some skulls bore the marks of blunt trauma delivered with forceful blows. Others showed sharp cuts, evidence of stone axes or blades, and among the fragments were signs of burning. Ashes and charred bone mingled with pottery and animal remains. This was not the quiet rest of ancestors. This was ritual destruction, the violent breaking of bodies in ceremonies that fused life, death, and fire. The most unsettling finds were the children. In one pit, archaeologists uncovered the remains of a young child, no more than 6 years old, buried alongside the carcass of a dog. The two had been positioned together carefully, their bones interlaced, as if meant to travel into death as companions. In another area, the bones of infants were found scattered with broken pottery and antler tools. The placement was too deliberate to be accidental. The interpretation was clear: these were offerings. Why would a society devote such effort to building a colossal monument only to use it as a stage for sacrifice? Some scholars believe the answer lies in fear. For Neolithic people, the world was unpredictable. Crops failed, winters were harsh, disease struck without warning. To them, life and death were tied to forces they could not control: the sun, the moon, the seasons. By offering sacrifices, they may have believed they were bargaining with the cosmos, ensuring fertility, survival, and balance. But the structure's sheer size and complexity suggest it was more than local ritual. Isotope testing of the bones revealed individuals from hundreds of miles away. They had traveled to this place, perhaps willingly, perhaps not, to be part of ceremonies that ended in death. This means the site was a regional, perhaps even continental, center of ritual power, a hub where tribes converged to witness or participate in acts that would echo across generations. The soil itself revealed more mysteries. Samples from the ditches contained unusual concentrations of certain minerals, particularly phosphates, and traces of rare elements. Some scientists suggested this was simply the result of decomposition and burning, but others argued the concentrations were too high, too localized, as though something else had been deposited deliberately. Could it have been pigments for ritual, or even substances burned to create hallucinogenic smoke? Adding to the puzzle were the post holes, the massive rings of wooden posts that once stood within the structure were not simply functional supports. They appeared to form corridors and sight lines, directing movement through the site like a carefully planned theater. Some corridors aligned with solstices, others with lunar events, but in several cases, the post holes formed enclosed areas with no apparent exits, as though they were designed to contain something or someone. Speculation ran wild. Were these holding pens for sacrificial victims, kept within the wooden enclosures until the moment of ritual? Were they stages where chosen individuals were displayed before being offered to the gods? Or were they symbolic, built to represent cosmic prisons where forces of chaos were bound during ceremonies? The scale of the sacrifices became clear as more pits were excavated. Dozens of individuals, spanning all ages, were uncovered in a single season. Some had been decapitated, their skulls placed apart from their bodies. Others had been dismembered, with bones scattered across the site as if to spread their power. To modern eyes, it was gruesome. To the builders, it may have been sacred. One haunting find came from a central pit. At its base, archaeologists discovered a cluster of bones arranged in a circle surrounding a polished stone axe. The bones were from different individuals, men, women, children, yet they had been placed together as though forming a human ring around the object. The axe itself showed little wear, suggesting it was ceremonial, not practical. Was this a symbolic burial? Or was the axe the focal point of a sacrifice, with the dead arranged to guard it for eternity. The discovery sparked debate among scientists. Some insisted the evidence pointed to ritual violence, sacrifices meant to appease gods or ancestors. Others argued for symbolic acts, that the burned bones represented purification rather than killing. But the sheer number of violent injuries left little doubt. This was a place where death was not only witnessed but orchestrated. And yet, the most chilling thought is not just that sacrifices occurred. It is that they were timed with the cosmos. The entrances, aligned to solstices and lunar events, suggest that these rituals were performed at precise astronomical moments. Death itself was tied to the movement of the heavens, as though human blood was the currency that kept the universe in balance. This raises an unsettling question: who decided when the sacrifices would occur? The builders of this structure must have had priests, astronomers, or leaders with immense power. They alone could interpret the sky, declare the appointed time, and choose who would live and who would die. For those gathered in the shadow of the wooden posts and ditches, the rituals must have been both terrifying and awe-inspiring. A theater where the cosmos demanded its due, and human life was the offering. The evidence of sacrifice has also revived darker theories. Some researchers whisper that these structures may not have been built only for the gods of sun and moon. The alignment of pits and bones, the strange mineral traces, the scale of death, all hint at the possibility that the builders believed they were communing with something else. Whether spirits, ancestors, or forces from beyond the stars, we may never know. But the echoes of their fear and devotion are still written in the soil. 6,000 years ago, people gathered at this site to witness spectacles of life and death tied to the movements of the sky. Today, we uncover their bones, their tools, their fires, and we see only fragments. But the truth is clear: this massive ancient structure was more than a monument. It was a stage where humanity bound itself to forces it could not control, offering its own flesh and blood to keep the universe in balance. The discovery is shocking not only for what it tells us about them, but for what it forces us to ask about ourselves. How much of our history, how much of our faith in order and cosmos still rests on echoes of those ancient fires? Part 4: The discovery of the 6,000-year-old massive ancient structure forced archaeologists to confront a truth they had resisted for decades. Our ancestors were not simple farmers living in scattered villages. They were builders, engineers, astronomers, and priests who worked on scales we struggle to comprehend. This site was not an isolated curiosity. It was part of a far deeper and more mysterious chapter of human history, one that changes the way we understand civilization itself. The global implications became clear almost immediately. Across continents, ancient structures share eerie similarities. At Stonehenge, great stones aligned with the solstices and lunar cycles. In Turkey, Göbekli Tepe's 11,000-year-old pillars carried carvings of stars, animals, and gods arranged in deliberate patterns. In Malta, Neolithic temples mirror solar alignments. In Peru, the massive pyramids of Caral, built around the same time as this European mega-structure, emerged without signs of warfare, suggesting societies bound more by ritual than conquest. These sites were separated by oceans, mountains, and millennia. Yet all point to the same obsession: aligning human life and death with the heavens. Whether it was the rising sun, the longest night, the turning of the moon, or the cycles of stars, humanity's first monumental projects were cosmic in nature. They were not built for kings or empires, but for something greater, something eternal. The newly uncovered structure fits into this pattern with unsettling precision. Its circular design, its massive posts, its pits of bone and ash, all speak to a people who believed that survival required communion with forces beyond the human. The sacrifices uncovered in its soil suggest that life itself was the offering, that blood and fire were the keys to maintaining balance between earth and sky. This was not just architecture. It was a cosmic machine built to bind humanity to the rhythm of the universe. But why would societies so far apart build such similar monuments? Some argue the answer is simple. Everywhere, people looked up at the same sky. The sun and moon rise for all, the stars spin above every land, and agriculture depends on the turning of the seasons. Knowledge of the heavens was essential to survival. Perhaps each culture, in its own way, developed monuments to track these cycles and to give them meaning through ritual. Others, however, see a deeper connection. The sheer precision of these monuments, built long before writing or advanced tools, suggests knowledge passed down across generations, preserved not in books but in ritual. Some believe there may have been an older civilization, now lost to floods or disaster, that carried this knowledge and seeded it across the world. The builders of the mega structure may not have invented cosmic architecture, they may have inherited it. This idea remains controversial, but discoveries like this make it harder to ignore. When you stand among the great posts reconstructed on the site, or trace the circles carved into the soil, it is impossible not to feel that you are seeing the shadow of something greater. A plan, a system, a worldview that stretches back far beyond what we once believed. The impact on archaeology has been profound. The narrative of civilization beginning in Mesopotamia now seems simplistic. Instead, what we see is a patchwork of advanced societies rising across the globe, each building monuments not to themselves but to the cosmos. Civilization may not have begun in one place. It may have been a flame burning in many places at once, flickering across the world thousands of years earlier than we imagined. Yet this discovery also forces us to confront uncomfortable truths about ourselves. The bones in the pits remind us that these monuments were not merely peaceful observatories. They were theaters of sacrifice, places where belief demanded blood. Our ancestors gave up their children, their neighbors, perhaps even themselves, to keep the stars in balance. The great monuments of prehistory were not just triumphs of engineering. They were built on fear, devotion, and death. And still, they endure. The posts have long rotted, the fires have turned to ash, but the patterns remain carved into the earth. The alignments still hold. On the solstice, the sun still rises where the builders intended, casting its light along lines mapped 6 millennia ago. The monument still works. It is still a clock of the cosmos, still a reminder that human hands once bound stone and wood to the heavens. What does this mean for us today? Perhaps it shows that humanity's deepest instinct is not survival but meaning. We will move stones heavier than houses, dig ditches with antler picks, and build monuments that outlast empires, all in the hope that life has purpose. We will give our blood, even our lives, to believe that we are part of something larger. The 6,000-year-old megastructure is shocking not only for its scale, but for what it reveals about who we are.